Okay, so today we're really going to dig into this whole situation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Specifically, like, what are the chances for some kind of peace deal, and what about, the long-term
Right.
security of the country? Um, we've got a lot of different sources to look at here. Some stuff that really digs deep into all those security guarantees that Ukraine's been offered over the years, analyses of like all those times they tried to negotiate peace before.
Yeah.
And of course, we got to look at the whole current political landscape. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, I think what's interesting is that this isn't the first time, this whole question of security guarantees has come up for Ukraine. We really need to go all the way back to 1994.
Yeah, back when
Ukraine made that huge decision to give up its nuclear arsenal.
Yeah, that was a big deal. And a big part of that decision was the Budapest Memorandum.
Right.
And we've got some really interesting firsthand accounts from Yuri Kostenko.
Right.
He was like a key player in those negotiations.
Absolutely. And even back then, Kostenko was pushing for some really strong, legally binding guarantees from the U.S. and the U.K., not just some vague assurances.
So he wasn't messing around.
No, he really understood that Ukraine's security was, well, it was precarious even back then.
And it seems like, in a way, history might be repeating itself. We're hearing a lot about these potential security guarantees for Ukraine all over again.
Yeah.
But are these promises today any more concrete than the ones they got back in 94?
Well, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of skepticism out there, especially, from the Ukrainians who were actually involved in those past negotiations.
Makes sense.
Hanna Hopko, she's a former Ukrainian legislator, and she's been really vocal about this.
Right.
She says they need some really tangible, reliable security arrangements, none of this vague stuff.
And she's got a point, right?
Yeah.
Vague promises written down on a piece of paper aren't going to stop tanks.
Exactly.
So if we're talking about actual real security guarantees for Ukraine, what are the options that are actually on the table?
Well, there's a couple that people have been talking about. One option involves like a ton of economic and military aid, potentially with the idea that, it paves the way for NATO membership eventually. And then there's another option, which is a lot more immediate.
Okay.
And that would be extending NATO's Article 5 protections to Ukraine, which basically puts them under the West's, nuclear umbrella.
Okay, but that sounds kind of risky, doesn't it? Wouldn't extending Article 5 basically be a huge provocation to Russia?
You're right, yeah. That second option, it's seen as super unlikely.
Yeah.
It would be a really dramatic shift geopolitically.
Yeah, I mean, and that first option with the promise of NATO membership eventually, that doesn't really seem like a quick fix either.
No, it's more of a continuation of the current situation, which, let's be honest, hasn't exactly been a success in stopping Russia, has it?
No, not really. So maybe it's helpful to look back at some of those previous attempts at peace, like the Minsk agreements, which were supposed to end that conflict back in 2014.
Right.
We had Minsk first and then Minsk second. They were both trying to get a ceasefire and, find some kind of political solution.
Right. But they didn't really manage to get that lasting peace, did they?
No.
There were just too many problems. Like, there weren't clear consequences for breaking the agreements. People couldn't agree on how to interpret them or even how to actually implement them.
Right.
And then you've got the OSCE, who were supposed to be monitoring the ceasefire, but they faced tons of challenges and weren't very effective.
So basically those Minsk agreements were kind of like, what, symbolic gestures?
Yeah.
Without the power to actually enforce the peace.
Yeah, pretty much. And that brings us to Volodymyr Zelensky. Right. He gets elected in 2019, promising peace.
Right.
He even met with Putin that year.
Did they actually make any progress during those talks?
No, not really. I mean, they couldn't even agree on like a basic roadmap to get to peace.
Wow.
It wasn't really until Russia launched that full-scale invasion in 2022 that they started negotiating seriously again.
Okay, so there were these new rounds of talks.
Right. First in Belarus and then in Turkey.
And it seemed like at some point they actually got pretty close to an agreement.
Yeah, this is where the Istanbul Communiqué comes in, right?
Right.
Drafted early 2022, it outlined a pretty detailed framework for a potential peace deal. The main idea was that Ukraine would become neutral, no NATO membership, no foreign military bases, and a big reduction in their military forces.
Okay, so that's a pretty big concession for Ukraine, especially after everything they've been through.
Yeah.
So what were they going to get in return for all that?
Well, the agreement said that Ukraine would get security guarantees from a whole bunch of different countries.
Okay.
Including some big players, the UK, China, the US, France, and get this, even Russia.
Hold on, wait.
Yeah.
Russia was going to be one of the countries guaranteeing Ukraine's security.
That was the idea they were discussing.
That seems A little counterintuitive.
It does, a little bit, doesn't it? Of course, there were some disagreements, like who else should be on the list of guarantors.
Right.
Ukraine wanted Turkey, Russia wanted Belarus.
Okay, so they were getting into the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, they were. So the big question is,
Yeah.
why didn't this Istanbul Communiqué actually turn into a real peace deal?
Yeah. What went wrong?
Well, there are a lot of different opinions on that. Some people say the West, especially the U.S., didn't really like the terms of the agreement
Okay.
and didn't give Ukraine the firm commitments they were hoping for.
Interesting.
One article we saw even said that global powers are actively dashing the chances of a diplomatic resolution to Russia's war, you know?
Wow.
Like the West just wasn't ready for the war to end.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, isn't it?
There's also that whole story about Boris Johnson. He was prime minister of the UK at the time. And some people say he basically sabotaged the deal.
Right, but Sergei Rodchenko, he's a historian who's looked at all these negotiations really closely. He says that's just not true.
Okay.
There's no evidence that Johnson single-handedly killed the deal.
So it wasn't just Boris Johnson standing in the way of peace.
Exactly. Rodchenko also says, this idea that peace was just around the corner if only the West had been willing to compromise more, he pushes back against that too.
Interesting.
He says there were some fundamental problems with the Istanbul Communiqué, especially when it came to actually enforcing those security guarantees. Remember how we talked about Russia being one of the guarantors?
Yeah, it still seems odd to me.
Well, the way it was set up, any decision to defend Ukraine would have had to be agreed on by all the guarantor states. So that basically gave Russia veto power, which, kind of defeats the whole purpose of a security guarantee.
Yeah, makes it kind of pointless.
Right. So even if everybody had loved the Istanbul Communiqué, it's not clear how effective it would have actually been in protecting Ukraine.
Right, right. And then there's the question of, was Putin even negotiating in good faith?
Yeah.
I mean, what are his real goals in Ukraine? Does he just want Crimea and the Donbass? Or is he after something bigger, like regime change in Kyiv?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Rodchenko actually suggests that even Putin himself might not have a clear answer.
Interesting.
Like he might be adjusting his goals as things change, which makes it incredibly difficult to negotiate a lasting peace, right?
Yeah, if you don't even know what the other side wants,
Yeah.
how are you supposed to find some kind of common ground?
Exactly. And meanwhile, the war just keeps dragging on.
Yeah, with no end in sight. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion so far, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Definitely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Exactly. And we'll be right back after a short break.
Sounds good. So we've been talking a lot about all these diplomatic efforts and the agreements that didn't quite work out,
Right.
and the whole back and forth between all these different players. But now I think we need to look at what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, the reality on the battlefield is going to really affect how these negotiations go.
Exactly what we're seeing is that Russia's, despite all the problems they're facing, they're still holding their own in this conflict.
Yeah, we keep hearing about all these Russian casualties, and the sanctions are definitely hurting their economy. But they haven't exactly collapsed, have they?
No, not at all. In fact, Russian forces have actually been making advances in some areas, pushing further west into Ukraine. They've taken control of some really important logistical hubs, which weakens Ukraine's military position.
Okay, so they're making progress.
Mm-hmm.
What about manpower, though? Can Russia keep sending troops like this for a long time?
That's the big question a lot of analysts are asking right now.
Right.
There's definitely evidence that they're running low on experienced soldiers. They're having to rely more and more on recruits who haven't had much training.
So does that mean their military is going to get weaker over time?
Well, it's possible, but we're also seeing reports that Russians are still signing up to fight, and the Kremlin seems determined to keep those recruitment channels open.
So it's a mixed bag, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Russia's definitely facing some serious challenges, but they're also showing a level of resilience that I think a lot of people didn't expect.
And it's important to remember that they're fighting on Ukrainian soil. Right?
Exactly, which gives them certain advantages logistically.
Makes sense.
And let's not forget, they have that huge military-industrial complex.
Right.
It's under strain, for sure, but it's still churning out weapons and equipment.
So even with all the talk about how the sanctions are hurting Russia's economy, the impact on the actual battlefield might not be as immediate or as decisive as some people hope.
That's a really important point. I think it highlights how important it is to be realistic about the challenges Ukraine is up against.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder about Trump's approach, right?
Yeah.
He seems to be operating under the assumption that Russia is about to fall apart.
Right.
But is that really in line with what's actually happening?
That's a valid question to ask. I think if you're going to negotiate a peace deal effectively, you need to have a very clear understanding of both sides' strengths and weaknesses.
Hmm.
And it's not clear that the Trump administration actually has that understanding.
We were talking earlier about how Russia basically rejected Kellogg's peace plan.
Right.
They don't seem to be backing down on those territorial ambitions at all.
In fact, they've actually doubled down in some ways.
Really?
Lavrov has explicitly said that Russia isn't interested in just going back to the way things were before the invasion.
Wow. So they're not looking for a reset.
Not at all. And then you have Trump threatening to impose even more sanctions on Russia if they don't agree to negotiate.
Which seems kind of strange, doesn't it? I mean, the sanctions they already have are hurting Russia pretty badly.
It does seem like he's trying to squeeze even more out of them.
Yeah.
But the key question is, how is Russia actually responding to these threats? Are they feeling the pressure, or are they just digging in?
From what we're hearing, it sounds like they're digging in.
Yeah. Russia's response to Trump's threats has been basically dismissive.
Like they're saying, bring it on.
Pretty much they're pointing out that their economy hasn't imploded, they can still pay for their military operations, and there aren't any massive protests happening in Russia.
So they're projecting this image of strength and resilience.
Exactly, even though there are definitely some cracks beneath the surface.
Okay, so where does this leave us? It seems like neither side wants to give an inch, and the war just keeps going with no end in sight.
Yeah, that's basically the situation. And meanwhile, it's the Ukrainian people who are paying the price.
It's a pretty grim picture. It really emphasizes how urgently we need a diplomatic solution.
Right, but as we've been discussing, it's incredibly hard to come up with a peace agreement that both sides will accept and that can actually be enforced.
Especially when you've got a U.S. president who seems more interested in political games than actual diplomacy.
That might be a harsh way to put it, but it's hard to argue with the facts.
Yeah.
Trump's approach has been all over the place. Sometimes he praises Putin, sometimes he threatens him.
Right. He hasn't shown any real commitment to working with his European allies to find a solution everyone agrees on.
And we can't forget that he's made it harder to present a united front against Russia because he keeps questioning whether NATO is even relevant and suggesting that the U.S. might withdraw its support.
Yeah, those actions have consequences. They make Putin bolder and make it much harder to stand up to him.
So we end up with this situation where the chances for peace seem pretty slim. The human cost of the war just keeps rising, and the whole global order is being shaken up.
It's not a happy thought, is it?
Yeah.
But even in these dark times, I think it's important to remember that there's still hope.
Yeah.
Maybe by really understanding how complicated this conflict is and learning from the mistakes that have been made and demanding more from our leaders, we can start to build a more peaceful and just future.
That's a message we all need to hear right now. But before we get too carried away with hope, I think we need to come back to Ukraine and those very real challenges they're facing.
We haven't really talked about what a truly effective and lasting security arrangement for Ukraine would actually look like.
You're right. We need to explore that more. And we also need to think about the role the international community has to play in guaranteeing Ukraine's future, not just with words, but with actions.
Okay, so let's dig into those questions. What does a good outcome for Ukraine actually look like?
Right.
What would a security arrangement that actually protects them in the future actually involve?
Well, we've already talked about how the Budapest Memorandum was a complete failure. It just offered these vague assurances that turned out to be worthless when Ukraine was actually threatened.
Right.
So whatever comes next has to be much stronger, more specific, and most importantly, it has to be enforceable.
No more ambiguity, no more room for Russia to wiggle out of its commitments.
Exactly. But what does that actually mean in real terms?
Yeah, what specific measures could we be talking about here?
Well, it probably involves a few different things. Military aid is obviously going to be crucial. Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself, and that means getting a constant flow of weapons, training, and logistical support from its allies.
We've seen a lot of that aid already.
We have, but the question is, will it keep coming at the level Ukraine needs over the long term? And will it be enough to stop Russia from attacking again?
Because right now, the aid they're getting hasn't turned the tide of the war. Russia's still advancing, and they still control a lot of Ukrainian territory.
That's true. So maybe military aid isn't enough on its own. We also need to think about economic support.
Right.
Ukraine's economy has been absolutely wrecked by this war, and rebuilding it is going to be a massive job.
Yeah, a strong economy is really important for stability and security in the long run.
Absolutely. If a country has a thriving economy, it's less vulnerable to pressure from outside and less dependent on foreign aid.
But it's not all about money and weapons, is it? There's also the political side of things.
Right.
Ukraine needs strong institutions, a healthy democracy, and a society that can bounce back from these kinds of threats.
That's a really important point. I think ultimately true security comes from within. It's
Yeah.
about having a society that's united, that believes in its future, and is willing to fight for its values and its way of life.
And the Ukrainians have definitely shown that they have that.
Yeah, they have. They've been incredibly brave and resilient and determined, but they can't do it all on their own. They need the world to stand with them.
And that can't just be about sending money and weapons.
No.
It also means using diplomacy to isolate Russia, to make them face the consequences of their actions, and to build a framework for a lasting peace.
Exactly, because as we've seen, the alternative is this long, drawn-out war that destabilizes the whole region, makes the world less safe, and causes incredible suffering.
So we come back to this idea that we need a diplomatic solution.
We do.
But like we've been saying, it's much easier said than done, especially when you've got a U.S. president who just doesn't seem to get it. He doesn't seem to have a consistent plan or even a basic understanding of how complicated this all is.
It's definitely frustrating. We have the tools to create a more peaceful and stable world, but it feels like we don't have the leadership to use those tools effectively.
And in the meantime, the Ukrainian people are stuck in the middle. Their future is hanging by a thread.
It's a stark reminder that our choices, our actions, or even our inaction have real consequences. And in this case, those consequences mean people are dying, dreams are being shattered, and the world is teetering on the edge of chaos.
This is a pretty heavy topic, but I'm glad we had this conversation. It's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. So we were just talking about how tough things are for Ukraine, right? And how they really need a strong security setup that actually works to keep them safe in the future.
Yeah, we saw how those old agreements, like the Budapest Memorandum, totally failed to protect them.
Right. It's like they were given these vague promises that meant absolutely nothing when things got real.
Exactly. So what can we actually learn from those mistakes?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that any future agreement has got to be way more solid, way more specific. And the most important part, it has to actually be enforceable.
No more wishy-washy language, right? No more loopholes for Russia to exploit.
Exactly. But that's easy to say. The hard part is figuring out what that actually looks like. What specific things can we do to give Ukraine the security they need?
Yeah, what are the concrete measures we're talking about here?
Well, it's probably going to be a combination of things. Military aid is definitely key. Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. So that means a steady stream of weapons, training, all that logistical support from their allies.
We've seen a lot of that aid already, though.
We have, but the question is, will that support last? Will it be enough to actually stop Russia from being aggressive again? Right now, even with the help they're getting, Russia's still pushing forward, and they've got control of big chunks of Ukraine.
So maybe military aid on its own isn't the answer. What else would we need to think about?
Economic support is huge, too. I mean, their economy's been hammered by this war, and getting it back on track is going to be a massive undertaking. But a strong economy is really vital for long-term stability and security.
Right, it makes them less vulnerable to outside pressure, less dependent on handouts.
Exactly. But it's not just about money and weapons. There's the political side of things, too.
Yeah, of course.
Ukraine needs strong institutions, a healthy democracy, and a society that can withstand these external shocks.
It's like that inner strength, that belief in their own future, that's what will really allow them to protect their independence in the long run.
Absolutely. And, you know, the Ukrainian people have shown incredible bravery and resilience throughout all this.
They really have.
But they can't do it alone. They need the world to be there with them, backing them up.
And that backing can't just be about sending money and weapons, right?
Right.
It also has to include diplomatic efforts to isolate Russia, make them answer for what they've done, and try to build some kind of framework for a lasting peace.
That's essential. Because if we don't, we're looking at this long, drawn-out conflict that destabilizes the whole region, makes the world less safe, and causes immense suffering.
The stakes are so high.
They really are. And yet, we have a U.S. president who, during his campaign, promised to end this conflict, but his actions have been, well, inconsistent at best. It doesn't feel like he's genuinely committed to working with others to find a real solution.
It's like he's more worried about scoring political points than actual diplomacy.
Yeah, and that's been a big source of frustration, I think. His flip-flopping on NATO, his threats of more sanctions that don't seem like they'll change anything, his lack of a clear strategy, all of it has contributed to this stalemate.
It's a tough situation, no easy answers. But it's clear the Ukrainian people deserve better than this. They deserve real security, not just vague promises and half-hearted attempts. They deserve a future where they can live in peace and choose their own path.
Absolutely, and ultimately the responsibility for making that happen falls on the shoulders of the international community. We've got to learn from the mistakes that have been made, we have to stand strong with Ukraine, and we have to work tirelessly to build a world where peace is the reality, not just a hope, and where every nation's right to exist is respected.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complexities of the conflict in Ukraine.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a tough conversation, but important nonetheless. We hope that by exploring the challenges, understanding what's gone wrong, and looking at the paths forward, we can all contribute to creating a more peaceful and just world.